I suppose I'm becoming a relatively senior figure in the field, as in a little bit old, and it feels like things are very different than they were 30 years ago, that we were presented with this real hegemonic kind of history of this field, which I completely question now. I think we actually more or less need to throw it away and start again, but maybe that's a bit drastic, but we'll see. So yeah, I think we really do need to rethink our roots, the roots of technology-based music. And I think in order to do so, we need to do three things, probably. We need to think about who we're talking about and diversify the range of people that we reference and take our influences from. We need to think about the where and not just focus on Europe and the West as much. And I see a lot of this in the papers that we're looking forward to seeing over the next few days. But what I'm going to talk a bit about is the what. So actually the discipline of music technology or technology-based music. And it's a little bit personal to my research that I've done over the years. I've been very interested in the idea of visual music. There are lots of definitions of visual music around. Mine is not necessarily the best or the most widely used, but it is perhaps the shortest, which is why I've included it on my PowerPoint slide, which is just visual music involves the artistic expression or representation of musical ideas or material through ocular media. Very straightforward idea, really, that music can have a visual dimension, or indeed be entirely visual, which I've always found fascinating. And the reason I want to turn to this now, to this idea, I think it's an idea rather than a field, really, is that the more I have studied it and looked into it, the more I think it's a kind of hidden history that not that many people know about, but which actually informs really quite substantial things in our culture, whether they're things that we actually understand from a very young age about the world, technology, music, art. A lot of these things actually have their origins in this kind of voyage of discovery into looking at as to these correspondences between the sonic and the visual. It's a huge topic, and I could talk about this all day. I'm going to focus it on really sort of three chapters, if you like, three parts of the visual music journey, roughly across the sort of 18th, 19th and 20th centuries. This is definitely a historical one, this paper, and looking at some of these things. So I'm going to talk about sort of subsets of visual music, which are colour music, klangfarbe, and optical sound. I'm going to have a little section on each of those. And in each case, what I want to do is identify a few key developments in that field, which have very directly informed the development of music technology, even if we don't necessarily know about them. And what's useful about this is that they usually predate the hegemonic 30 years ago version of music technology that I was taught. And this is why I think we really need to rethink these things, is that a lot of the time the origins of these things go back considerably further than we thought they did. So I'm going to start with colour music, which is really the perhaps the origin story of visual music, really. It's the first of these parallels to be made between the visual and the sonic. And it goes back millennia. You can see discussions of the relationships between colour and musical pitch in Aristotle, for instance. I expect it to go back even further. But I tend to root my discussions in Isaac Newton and his work from about 1675, 76 is when he started to present some of these experiments, but they are all in the book Optics, which was published in 1704. And this is where Newton presented his research that we all know about discovering that white light was made out of component colours, splitting a beam of white light into the spectrum, and discovering many ways in which the spectrum of colour worked and the frequency content of that colour. What I always like to look at here is this figure 11 from optics, which is the first instance I know of a colour wheel. So just like you might find today in a image or video editing application, it's a colour wheel arranging the colours of the spectrum around a circular frequency space. And I could go on about this in itself quite a lot, actually, but I won't. There are some very interesting things about it. But one of the critical things here are these letters around the edge, which, not to beat about the bush too much, correspond to the notes of a musical scale. So what Newton did right from the get-go, and remember this is the first time this colour theory had been outlined at all, when it was outlined, Newton speculated that the colours corresponded to the notes of a musical scale. And this is where we come to something that's close to what I describe as a kind of hidden history, that we sort of all know this, even though we don't know where it comes from. So when we talk about a rainbow having 7 colours, there are 7 colours in the rainbow, and we learn little rhymes to remember them at school, the only reason we say there are 7 colours in the rainbow is because Newton said so, and the only reason Newton said so was to correspond them to a note to a musical scale. So every kid learning a rhyme about the colours of the rainbow is actually sort of reflecting the history of visual music, which is quite interesting. And just another example, this is not something I carefully sought out, this was just lying around in my house. But this is a visual music instrument, really. This just came from a toy shop when my kids were little. But it does codify this colour system of the spectrum going across a scale. What scale that is, by the way, just to finish this little preamble, is a little bit open to question, and there are many versions. And in fact, Newton's, if you go back, is in fact a Dorian scale. This is something that gets rather inaccurately reflected in subsequent writing. So it doesn't start from C, it starts from D. But anyway, what I want to talk about just briefly now, before moving on, is the development of colour music as a field and the instruments that developed around it. Because it seems to me that in fact many of the developments that feed into subsequent sonic instruments can actually be found here. And there's a sort of longer history of technological development around these instruments than there is perhaps in music, or certainly some things predate where we find them in music. So I'm just going to look at a couple of famous examples of instruments to play colour music. The earliest known is the clavecin pour les yeux, built by Louis Bertrand Castel in 1725. No real images exist of this. This is a kind of caricature for a contemporary publication. But yeah, this was an early example. And a much later example, and better known really, is Alexander Wallace Remington's colour organ, built in 1893. Both of these were, of course, mechanical instruments. But if we look into the early 20th century, we see some really interesting electromechanical instruments appearing in this field. And they do predate similar developments in music. So they're slightly ahead of the likes of the sort of Wurlitzer electromechanical organ or the Hammond organ, the sort of tone wheel based organ. And there are a few I could talk about. The best well-known name probably is Thomas Wilfred, who did some remarkable work in the early 20th century. But I want to look in particular at Mary Hallett Greenwaldt, who was alive from 1871 till 1950, and did most of her key work in the 20s and 30s, 1920s and 30s. She was a concert pianist, but also an inventor, and a really prolific inventor. It said inventor on her passport, not pianist, even though that was her original training. And she filed, I think, 30 patents during her lifetime. And they were mostly concerned with something she called the sarabet, which is this instrument, which is a console or instrument for performing colour music. And there are various really interesting things in this instrument which she can take full credit for inventing, and have become very important in subsequent music instruments, but also technology more broadly. So yeah, here are some diagrams from her patent applications with some judiciously applied colour. And they fed into things like the light phonograph, which was a record player that also produced a coloured light show encoded in the recording. And the sarabet itself. If you look at the sarabet patent document here, you'll see the word rheostat in the middle, and this was one of her key patent applications, and she had an enormous amount of trouble with this. Skip over a slide there. Here's a little quote which I won't read out here, but it reflects a running litigious battle she had with General Electric through most of her life over this rheostat patent. So rheostat being an early form of variable resistor. I don't need to tell you how important that is to our instruments, that we need variable resistors. Yeah, for the whole of her lifetime, she was battling infringements on this invention that she made by everyone from other practitioners. So she had a running battle with Thomas Wilfred, to big corporations like General Electric. The nice thing is she did actually win. Eventually her case was upheld on this patent. But yeah, it's really fascinating to me that yeah, we wouldn't have any of the synthesizers really that we have, and particularly in terms of the performance interface, without this work that she did to develop that console. So I'm going to move on to my next section now, and this is a term, Klangfarbe, which appeared in the late 19th century, and I expect you all know this term, perhaps in a longer form, perhaps Klangfarben Melodie from Schoenberg, but it's a fairly well recognised term in music history, really, but it does have a broader context than that. Now, one of the reasons I chose these titles is that they all mean the same thing, really. So we started with visual music, then colour music, now Klang, Farbe, Klang of course being sound and Farbe being colour. So we're still really talking about sound and colour. We've tended to make this assumption in music history and music technology history that this is a term that we coined, that we invented, and that it's a musical thing, and that the word colour in there is not in any way literal, that we're just talking about colour as in sort of timbre. But in fact, this whole dialogue about similarities between frequency space in colour and frequency space in sound was still very much there in this whole dialogue. Now, talking about this period of history in visual music, I tend to put it down to two key influences, really, and neither of them are from music. So from the first is from physics, and Helmholtz, Hermann von Helmholtz, and his book On the Sensations of Tone, published in 1863. And this I have actually spent quite a lot of time studying recently because of other writing. And it's remarkably similar in some ways to Newton's optics. It does a similar job, really, of unpicking the frequency components of sound. And what Helmholtz was particularly concerned with was harmonics, or harmonicity within musical tones. He would usually call it musicalish Klangfarbe, so musical tone colour. And it's close to timbre, that's really what we're talking about, but it does tend to be based on harmonic sounds. So here's an instrument that he designed called the Helmholtz Sound Synthesizer. Also, I think this version, which was built by instrument builder Koenig, is actually slightly later, but only slightly, 1865, I think. But again, here we can see another version of a prototypical synthesizer here. And here we're much closer, and really it's remarkable how many aspects of sound synthesis are visible in this instrument and audible, of course. So we have, again, an interface, actually much more simplistic than the Hallett Greenwaldt instrument. But each one of these objects here is a voice, essentially, what we call a voice in a synthesizer. And it has a classic sort of, I'm almost going to say a Moog kind of model of synthesis, really. But there's an oscillator in each case, which is a tuning fork being activated by electromagnets, and a filter or a resonator, which is this cylinder. There are many forms of these resonators, actually, in various shapes that Helmholtz designed. What's not completely clear here, but you'll see from some videos, is there are these little sort of lollipop stick-shaped things that mechanically move over the entrance to the resonating chamber to control how it resonates with the sound. The other key influence at this point, and from a very different direction, is Helena Blavatsky, who founded the Theosophical movement, who many of you will know a lot of the key artistic figures of this period, early 20th century, either in art or music, or I'm sure elsewhere, were involved in. And what's interesting about her work, which has its roots in Eastern philosophies, really, it's a very early example of this synthesis of many different spiritual movements. So it has elements of Buddhism and Hinduism in there. But one of the key ideas in there is what I see actually as the more I think about it, it's a kind of early version of cybernetics, in a sense, of observing that many of our technologies are based on electricity, and in particular oscillations in electricity, but so are life forms, and so are we. So the world itself, or the art that we make, and the way in which we perceive it are sort of one and the same. And this can be extrapolated into what I might call woo territory. You know, it very much is kind of, hey, we're all in a sea of vibrations, check out my chakras, man, kind of territory. I live in Frome, so I hear a lot of this stuff. And of course, that's no coincidence. We might call that New Age philosophy, and New Age philosophy, as defined in the 60s, is directly descended from Theosophy. But these two things, this understanding of frequency space on a much more subtle level, and this philosophical idea that we ourselves might be part of this picture led to a real evolution of these ideas as to how sound and image might work in the same ways. And for me, it reflects a much more satisfactory model than colour music, in that it doesn't make this really simplistic idea that you could just have a note and a colour and that they might be the same because they're both frequencies. So I just want to look at a couple of bits of writing from two key figures at the time. So firstly, Kandinsky and his book concerning the spiritual in art, which is more or less his response to theosophy, amongst other things. And there's this very well-known quote from there, often misquoted, but I think this is, in fact I know this is correct, I did check yesterday. Colour is the keyboard, the eyes are the harmonies, the soul is the piano with many strings. The artist is the hand that plays, touching one key or another to cause vibrations in the soul. So this brings together quite neatly this idea that we ourselves might resonate with colours or with pictures. But here's another one, a more specific quote. And this is a section where he talks about specific colours. Warm red intensified by suitable yellow is orange. The blend brings red almost to the point of spreading out towards the spectator, but the element of red is always sufficiently strong to keep the colour from flippancy. Orange is like a man convinced of his own powers. Its note is like that of an angelus or an old violin. Now there are a few things I want to draw out of that. First, Kandinsky never, ever said, oh, red is middle C, or green is whatever. He was never simplistic enough to just say, oh, colours correspond to frequencies. What he was much more prone to do was to associate colours with timbres, or with, more accurately, klangfarbs, if that can be pluralised in that way. So he saw that colours were like a kind of spectral thing rather than a single frequency. Secondly, he brought in all these cultural implications to colours, and wasn't just a phenomenological thing. He talks about purple being the colour of mourning in many cultures, for instance, that sort of thing. And thirdly, he brings an element of movement into this. So he talks about how this colour might move towards the viewer. Schoenberg, who of course was a very good friend of Kandinsky's, and some of this is from their correspondence actually. This is from his book Harmony Lehre in 1911. And this reflects his understanding of klangfarb. The distinction between tone, colour and pitch, as usually expressed, I cannot accept without reservations. I think that the tone becomes perceptible by virtue of tone colour, of which one dimension is pitch. Tone colour is thus the main topic, pitch a subdivision. Pitch is nothing else but tone colour measured in one direction. Now I'm running out of time a bit already, I can tell, so I'm not going to dwell on that quote, but I suggest you do, because it's really, there's a lot in there. So the picture, by the way, there, if someone might have spotted, is from Farben, which is the third movement of the 5 pieces for orchestra that Schoenberg wrote in 1909. And it's a perfect example, practice-led example of this phenomenon of a klangfarb. It's a chord that doesn't really change, but the frequency components do over time, as you can sort of see from that first page. And he describes this as music without architecture, without structure, only an ever-changing, unbroken succession of colours, rhythms and moods, drawing close to the principles of contemporary painting. So at the same time as Kandinsky was trying to kind of make a visual music, Schoenberg was trying to kind of make an orchestral painting. And there's this really interesting sort of dialogue between the two. Just to finish this section, I want to look at two later people associated with this idea, who again prefigure some much later research, really. So the first is a singer called Margaret Hughes, who was from Cardiff, and she invented an instrument called the idophone in 1891. And this allowed her to visualise her voice. And in fact, that was her main interest, was to be able to see the frequency component of her sung voice, both as a sort of technical exercise. She used it to develop her singing and that of her pupils, but also as a philosophical one. And it produced these really beautiful patterns. If you want to find out more about this, you need to talk to Rob Mullender at CRISAP, LCC, who's writing a book about her. But what you can see here is basically harmonic series captured using this instrument. And again, it's very far ahead of its time. It's a little bit like the work done by Chladni, much earlier in the Chladni plates, but it's much more like cymatics, which was written about by Hans Jenny in the 60s. But this, of course, is much earlier. Another example I want to talk about is Oskar Fischinger, pet topic of mine, key figure in visual music and early animator. Of course, I could talk about many ways in which he influences what we've done, what we do, but the key thing I want to talk about really is his philosophy again. He wasn't exactly a theosophist, but he had absorbed many of these ideas about kind of universal vibration and so on. And the reason I think that's important, particularly, is by one step removed, which is that, again, rather little known facts, but Oskar Fischinger worked with John Cage very briefly. John Cage worked as his assistant in 1937 on a film called Optical Poem, which you can see being filmed here. And Fischinger wrote this, Cage wrote this poem about Cage, which says, "When you said each inanimate object has a spirit that can take the form of sound by being set into vibration, I became a musician. It was as though you'd set me on fire. I ran without thinking and threw myself into the water." So Cage credits Fischinger with this complete transformation of his philosophy around sound. It's very interesting. To the last section, which is optical sound. Again, we've got this pairing of the words, one visual and one sonic. But this is a much more specific technology, really, which is the technology used for sound on film between about 1930 and about 1970. So it wasn't the very first technology. The jazz singer, which many of you will know is the first talkie, really used very large vinyl discs that were synchronized with the film. But shortly thereafter, this technology was invented to directly write sound onto film in a very direct way. So we're just literally talking about membranes and mirrors and light being reflected onto film. And there's, again, a really interesting sort of hidden history of artists using that to synthesize sound. And this is the key, why I really wanted to get here. This is one of the key things I want you to take from my presentation today, is that really I think this is where we find early synthesis, not where we're normally told to look. And I think I will, given the lack of time, just show you one example of that. And I'll skip over Fischinger's work, which is an instrument called the variophone, which was developed in 1932 by Yevgeny Sholpo, working in St. Petersburg. And if you want to read more about this, I really wish, it's only just over there, I could go and grab it, but there's the book by Andrei Smirnov called Sound in Z, which documents this history of Russian music technology, which I highly commend to you. But this instrument was directly able to directly print waveforms onto film using spinning discs like this for the various waveforms. But it was extremely capable, and this is what I find completely remarkable about this, is we're talking about a fully fledged polyphonic synthesizer from 1932. It could produce up to 12 notes of polyphony, any kind of waveform that you like, glissandi, articulations, that kind of thing. And yes, I will just quickly finish with a little segment of music produced using this instrument. I'll leave that there. The one little bit I didn't get to, but we'll just quickly point you towards, was Daphne Oram and the Oramix machine, which a little bit later in the 60s represents a really interesting evolution of these ideas. And I think, you know, we talk about the Moog versus Buchla kind of alternate models of synthesis in the late 50s. And I really feel that the Oramix machine should be seen as at least as important as those two in terms of offering a whole different model of synthesis that was really driven by the visual interface. And thank you again.